The night was dark and cold, the kind that feels like it could swallow you whole. Inside Graceland, the grand mansion where Elvis Presley had once lived, the air was thick with sadness. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, stood in the kitchen, his shoulders slumped and his eyes red from crying. He had just returned from another failed trip to Tupelo, Mississippi, where he had hoped to find the grave of his second son, Jesse. But the grave was long gone, erased by time and the elements. Vernon's voice was heavy with grief as he announced to the small group gathered in the kitchen, "We won't be able to find Jesse's grave. We'll have to settle for a memorial plaque instead." The room fell silent, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Vernon's eyes filled with tears, and he turned away, unable to bear the weight of his loss any longer. A few days later, a small memorial service was held at Graceland. The mansion was lit by the harsh glare of newly installed lights, casting long shadows over the freshly dug grave. A large tent, erected by the funeral home, stood over the gravesite, and the air was filled with the chill of an October night. Only a handful of close friends and family members were invited, and even they seemed to be outnumbered by the funeral home staff. Vernon, his sister Delta, and his brother-in-law Dodger sat in folding chairs near the graves, watching as two shiny white hearses pulled up to the service drive. The caskets of Elvis and his mother, Gladys, were carefully unloaded and placed on wheeled carts. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of traffic from Elvis Presley Boulevard, a street named in honor of the king of rock and roll. The casket of Elvis, still as shiny as the day he was buried, was wheeled to the grave site. To everyone's surprise, Gladys's casket, which had been buried since 1957, looked just as new. Vernon had inspected both caskets at the cemetery, and noted only a small spot of rust on one of the handles of Gladys's casket. The caskets were then lowered into their waiting vaults, and the service began. It was a short and simple ceremony, led by a minister whose words seemed to echo the emptiness in everyone's hearts. After a final prayer, the family and friends began to walk around the swimming pool and back toward the main house. Vernon stopped at the corner of the pool, looking back at the graves of his son and his mother. His eyes filled with tears, and he straightened his shoulders before turning away. "Elvis and his mother are now home again, this time for good," Vernon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the way it should be." But the pain was still there, and the mansion felt different without Elvis. Vernon's heart ached, but at least he could visit their graves whenever he wanted, without the intrusion of fans who had once flocked to Forest Hills Cemetery. A few days after the service, Vernon called the remaining staff into the kitchen. They were all worried that the death of Elvis would mean the end of their jobs, but Vernon's words brought a glimmer of hope. "You have all been a part of Elvis's world for so long, and nothing has changed as far as this being the Presley home. As long as I'm able to do so, I intend to keep it that way. My mother and my sister still live here, and that's not going to change." The mansion continued to run much as it had before, but some changes were inevitable. Charlie Hodge, who had lived at Graceland for years, moved out. Billy Smith, who had lived in a mobile home on the property, also left, and tensions ran high over the ownership of the mobile home. Vernon, meanwhile, moved into the annex apartment and continued to run the affairs of Graceland. A few months later, Vernon's health began to decline. On October 26, 1978, he suffered a heart attack and was taken to the hospital. I visited him often, bringing him home cooked meals like chopped steak, string beans, and fried chicken. He talked about farming and asked me to have my husband plant peas and white corn for him. But despite these moments of hope, Vernon's health continued to deteriorate. He passed away on the morning of June 26, 1979, and was laid to rest in the meditation garden between his son and his first wife. Less than a year later, in May of 1980, Dodger died peacefully in her bed. The funerals were taking their toll on everyone, and the mansion felt emptier with each passing day. Aunt Delta, the last surviving Presley, continued to live in her bedroom off the kitchen, but the mansion was never the same again. The personal touches that had kept Graceland running were slowly replaced by more commercial ways of doing business. The human touch was fading away. Aunt Delta, now alone, felt the weight of her loneliness. The house was still decorated for the holidays, but it was different without the warmth of the family. Graceland stood as a monument to the past, a place where the echoes of Elvis's music and the laughter of his loved ones still lingered, but the mansion itself was changing. She would sometimes have friends over, and we'd make meals together. But mostly, she spent her time with Edmund, her Pomeranian, a gift from Elvis. When Edmund passed away, we buried him in the back pasture with a small headstone. She soon got another Pomeranian, and named him Edmund II. This new dog lived just as luxuriously, getting all the love and care the first one did. Some of us joked we wanted to come back as one of Aunt Delta's dogs in our next life. She always made sure we treated the dogs well. In 1993, Aunt Delta passed away in her sleep. She had been very ill and bedridden for a while. Her passing was a relief, ending her suffering, but she would be greatly missed. Her funeral wasn't at Graceland. It was a small service at Forest Hills Cemetery Chapel. She was buried near Elvis and Gladys. Only a few family and friends were there to say goodbye. After she died, the kitchen was open for tours. Sometimes I drive by Graceland at night, and it's hard to see the empty rooms. It's strange to think that no one lives there anymore, except for the workers who keep the place tidy. Aunt Delta never expected to be the last Presley in the house when she moved in back in 1967. Her death marked the end of an era. A part of Graceland died with her, the last chapter of a grand old house that had seen so many good and bad times. Now it stands as a mansion full of silent memories. I'm grateful to have been a part of the life that unfolded inside Graceland. Those memories will stay with me forever.